Chapter 3, Johnson versus Humphrey. Johnson and Humphrey appeared at odds as the campaign kicked off. The Democratic nominee made an offhand remark on September 9th that he hoped the first American troops could start coming home from Vietnam in 1969. The next day, the president told the American Legion convention in New Orleans,
"We yearn for the day when our men can come home. No man can predict when that day will come, because we are there to bring an honorable, stable peace to Southeast Asia, and no less will justify the sacrifices that our men have died for."
It sounded like the president was correcting the vice president. Nixon seized the opportunity. He accused Humphrey of hurting the U.S. negotiating position by allegedly promising to cut combat troops. The Republican held a big lead in the Gallup poll. Nixon, 43%. Humphrey, 28%. Wallace, 21%. On the afternoon of Monday, September 30th, 1968, a news ticker in the White House spat out Lyndon Johnson's nightmare. A wire service story Dateline Salt Lake City reported that at 7:30 that night, Vice President Humphrey would make a nationwide address on the NBC television network promising a bombing halt.
As president, I would stop the bombing of the North as an acceptable risk for peace because I believe it could lead to success in the negotiations and thereby shorten the war. This would be the best protection for our troops. In weighing that risk and before taking action, I would place key importance on evidence, direct or indirect by deed or word, of communist willingness to restore the demilitarized zone between North and South Vietnam. Now, if the government of North Vietnam were to show bad faith, I would reserve the right to resume the bombing.
Humphrey's speech placed just one condition on the bombing halt. Johnson still had three. At 6:45 p.m., an aide told Johnson that Richard Nixon was on the line. The president interrupted a meeting to take the call.
"The only reason I bother you is that I'm going in very shortly to be on a television program. And there just came over the wire this statement by Hubert with regard to saying that he would have a bombing pause if elected. And the only purpose of my call is to determine whether there's any change in our own policy at this time with regard to what position the administration is taking."
No, there's not. I have not read his speech, and it has not been discussed with me. I say this in strict confidence.
"I understand."
I don't want you to quote me or repeat me, so I'll talk freely.
I won't. I'm not even letting anybody know I called you.
LBJ did know what the U.S. military commander in Vietnam was saying about a bombing halt and freely shared that classified information with the opposition party's nominee. At this point, General Abrams said stopping the bombing would give the enemy an opportunity to position troops, tanks, and artillery due north of the DMZ
in a position to initiate a large-scale invasion of South Vietnam with minimum warning time.
It took 80,000 North Vietnamese soldiers and up to 200,000 laborers to maintain Hanoi's air defenses. A bombing halt would give the North several options for redeploying them,
any of which would increase the threat to American forces.
Johnson handed Nixon material for the strongest possible attack.
A bombing halt at this time would aid the enemy and jeopardize American lives.
The president made it clear he was not backing down from any of his three conditions.
So in effect, we have said we are interested in what you have to say on these three subjects: the DMZ, GVN presence, and shelling the cities.
Yeah, but you don't insist on all three, just...
Well, we'd like to have all three, but we asked them to make their commitment to us, tell us what they would do.
Nixon remained deferential to Johnson throughout.
Humphrey's speech will be interpreted, as I'm sure you know, as a dramatic move away from the administration. It's my intention not to move in that direction.
Nixon assured the president.
I just wanted to be sure that I was up to date on everything.
There are two versions of Humphrey's next conversation with Johnson. The one in Humphrey's memoirs and the one on Johnson's tapes. Humphrey comes off a lot stronger in his book.
About 15 minutes before I began my speech, I called President Johnson from the studio. I told him what I intended to say, and he said curtly,
"I gather you're not asking my advice."
I said that was true, but that I felt that there was nothing embarrassing to him in the speech and certainly nothing that would jeopardize peace negotiations. I said we had been in direct contact with Averell Harriman and that George Ball was there with me. Johnson said tartly and finally,
"Well, you're going to give the speech anyway. Thanks for calling, Hubert."
And that was that.
The tapes and documents tell a different story. Humphrey didn't call 15 minutes before the speech. He waited until literally the last minute. The White House Daily Diary recorded his call coming in at 7:30 p.m. exactly when his pre-recorded address began to air nationwide. If not for press reports, Johnson would have had no advance warning. The timing of Humphrey's call denied the president any opportunity to talk his vice president out of it, or to threaten him out of it, as he had done before. Both LBJ quotes in Humphrey's story are inaccurate. The president did not grudgingly recognize his number two's independence with such words as,
I gather you're not asking my advice.
or,
Well, you're going to give the speech anyway.
Johnson did not say these things curtly or tartly. Since he did not say them at all, he did, to be fair, say,
Thank you, Hubert.
Humphrey didn't mention Ambassador Harriman. When LBJ found out 3 days later that the Humphrey campaign had discussed the bombing halt speech in advance with Johnson's own negotiators in Paris, he was outraged. On tape, Humphrey sounds a little apologetic.
I just thought I should have called you a little earlier.
When he read the one condition in his speech, Johnson said,
Well, we have three. Now, we don't want to divide up North or South Vietnam without both of them being present. So that ought to be understood before we give up our whole card. That if we bring them in, they wouldn't walk out. Negotiate in good faith with whom? With both of us, you see. The second thing is, we couldn't very well keep the bombing stopped very long, I think, from a practical standpoint, if they shell the cities.
Yeah, well, that's what we would mean by good faith negotiations, Mr. President.
Well, all right. Okay.
while Humphrey was assuring the president that his speech covered all three conditions. His aides were telling reporters that he wouldn't even insist on the one he'd mentioned.
One of the vice president's key foreign policy advisors said later that in mentioning the demilitarized zone, Mr. Humphrey had meant only to give an example of the kind of sign that might be forthcoming, not a quid pro quo.
The New York Times reported.
The vice president was reported to feel that his new public stance on the bombing, one of the central issues in the presidential campaign, was noticeably softer than that of President Johnson. Mr. Humphrey's advisors hope that his statement will be interpreted by the peace faction in the Democratic Party as a break with the Johnson administration.
Humphrey tried to make Johnson and LBJ supporters who might be favorably inclined toward his vice president by association think that he was standing with the president. At the same time, he tried to make Doves, LBJ's biggest critics within his own party, think that he was breaking with LBJ, who was straddling the issue, a much more complex and dangerous maneuver than mere flip-flopping. All it takes to execute a flip-flop is to move from one position to another. To straddle, however, a politician must take two opposite positions at the same time. The chances of catastrophic exposure are that much greater. Politicians caught in flip-flops can at least claim they've changed their minds. A politician caught in a straddle must claim to be of two minds. Humphrey was straddling the biggest issue of the 1968 presidential campaign in its final days, the moment of maximum media scrutiny. The president didn't like this one bit. He intervened in the campaign against his party's nominee, LBJ's old colleague from across the aisle, the Senate Minority Leader since LBJ had been Majority Leader. Illinois Republican Senator Everett Dirksen knew him well enough to sense opportunity. He called the president and gingerly asked a question.
Are you at liberty to make some comment on Hubert's speech last night?
It took the president less than an hour to call back with some expert advice on how to go after his vice president.
On this subject you called me about, I've had a good going over, and I would say that the best position on it is, what does he mean? Yeah, okay, I follow. That's up to him to say what he means. If he means unilateral without any conditions, that's one thing. If he means they've got to reinstitute the DMZ, well, then that's another thing. Now, what does he mean? That's not quite clear, and we don't want to be critical, and just wait until you hear further from him. And that's the way. I think that the other fellows oughtn't to get involved until that's clear. If he has a condition that you have to close up that DMZ where people can't come down there, well, then I don't think everybody would be for that. We want it closed. We've been urging it all along. But the question is, does he make that a condition, or does he unilaterally pull out first? Do you get that clear? Yes, I do. Now, I'll have the NSC staff elaborate on each one of these points. There are 4 or 5 of them. And tomorrow, or the next day, I'll give you a little short, succinct briefing so you can be positioned not to let your people be irresponsible and talk to your other fellows around the country so that they'll know exactly how we analyze the thing. Okay. And I'll just use you as the transmittal belt. Okay.
What did Humphrey mean? It was a clear, simple question, and Johnson knew that his vice president dared not answer it. For Humphrey to give any substantive answer, that he would insist on restoring the DMZ or not, that his position was the same as LBJ's or not, would throw him off his straddle. Thus did the Democratic President of the United States advise the highest-ranking elected Republican in the country regarding the best way to campaign against the Democratic Vice President and presidential nominee, offering the services of the NSC staff to furnish talking points to the opposition party. That was just gravy. Either Dirksen was a well-oiled transmittal belt or Nixon came up with the same idea as Johnson independently, because at a press conference that morning, the Republican nominee asked his opponent for the thing he dared not provide: clarification. Nixon called Humphrey's speech
his fourth and possibly fifth different position on a bombing halt.
Humphrey had to choose, Nixon said.
He either has to be for the bombing halt, as some of his prospective supporters and present supporters want him to be, or he has to support the negotiators in Paris.
Nixon mocked his opponent for saying he would take a risk for peace by stopping the bombing.
I would respectfully submit that the risk is not his. The risk that is taken is to the thousands of Americans in the DMZ whose lives would be threatened in the event that a bombing halt occurred and the North Vietnamese forces were able to attack them in greater numbers than presently is the case.
This was the ammunition Johnson provided Nixon from the latest classified cable from General Abrams. Finally, the Republicans sounded the president's favorite theme, calling a bombing halt the trump card in the hands of American negotiators, he said.
Now, if that trump card is played by either of the presidential candidates by indicating that we in January might do something that the negotiators have refused to do in Paris, it means that all chance for those negotiations to succeed will evaporate.
Asked to clarify his position, the Democratic nominee took a firm stand against taking a firmer stand. He told reporters,
My statement speaks for itself.
He dismissed attempts to pin down what he was for or against.
Let me put it this way. What I have said is my position. I haven't tried to equate positions with the administration or with the critics. If this happens to agree with some parts of administration policy, well and good. If it disagrees, that's the way it has to be. If it agrees with some position somebody else has taken, well and good. If it disagrees, so be it.
Humphrey somehow managed to make ambiguity sound bold, brash, even defiant. Bereft of answers, the Times resorted to printing its own questions. Would Humphrey require any kind of signal from Hanoi before he stopped the bombing?
Would the signal have to be associated with the demilitarized zone, or was that mentioned only as an example?
Humphrey wasn't saying. Ambassador Harriman, however, answered Nixon. He had a spokesman tell the press that, contrary to Nixon's pointed suggestion, the leader of the American delegation to the Paris talks saw no reason whatsoever to think that Humphrey's speech would hurt the negotiations. The president was furious with his chief negotiator.
He's a damn fool. He's been playing politics.